couldn't let anything go by. I had to get revenge.
Also revealed that he once faced a gunman himself during a stick-up at a Popeyes fast food restaurant when he was a young medical resident in Baltimore.
I have had a gun held on me. The guy comes in, puts the gun in my ribs, and I just said, I believe that you want the guy behind the counter. He said, oh, okay.
What happened is that some of our philosophers got off base. And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites. So that love is identified with a resignation of power and power with a denial of love. It was this misinterpretation that caused the philosopher Nietzsche, was the philosopher of the will to power, to reject the Christian concept of love. It was the same misinterpretation which induced Christian theologians to reject Nietzsche's philosophy of the will to power in the name of the Christian idea of love. Now we got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We are broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Good evening.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Super producer David Slavic in the digitosphere, roaming the Discord in the ever-expanding, ever-global, ever-fusing love and power TMBS universe. On this week's program, doubleheader, Daniel Bessner. He's the foreign policy pro advocating a left foreign policy. We're talking about what a proactive leftist foreign policy might actually look like, specifically with regard to China and the Uyghur population. A solidarity campaign for Lula as Brazil's Bolsonaro Wall Street-backed gangster government is unraveling weeks into power. New reporting shows links between the fascist regime of Bolsonaro and potentially the murder-for-hire gang that assassinated Marielle Franco. Plus, we'll be talking about what to do about Venezuela, the breakthrough Michelle Alexander piece calling for justice in Palestine in the New York Times. Then Corey Pein, author of Live, Work, 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 Die. He's going to be joining us to talk a little bit about the paramilitary RSS and the BJP party in India. I wonder what totally unprompted, spontaneous candidacy prompted that. And then he's going to be hanging out with us while we talk about this new Oxfam report in the Griscom segment. Democracy or billionaires? Can't have both, let alone basic decency and justice. In the postgame, Anand Giridharadas pissed off Tony Blair and Bill Gates in one day, and that means we're going to throw Davos into the gulag, and we've got candidates to review. Kamala Harris is here. Tulsi Gabbard is still here. Christian Gillibrand, we probably won't even review, as we hold out hope for a return of Bernie. All that and much, much more in the post-game. Time to become a patron, my friends. But first, let's start with a very basic, very fundamental truth. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a capitalist. By the end of his life, he might not have been a Marxist. He was probably something of a social democrat, certainly at the very least a social democrat, keenly opposed to war and imperialism, and someone who correctly drew the connections tightly and firmly between the abuse of American apartheid, American poverty, American anti-labor policies with America's mass murder and imperialism in Vietnam. The political risk of speaking out against that war alienated him, of course, from the Johnson administration and the liberal establishment of the 1960s. Now, it's almost become its own cliche to correct the record on MLK every MLK Day. We have to remind everybody that this was not only an incredible intellect and leader, but also a political radical, one absolutely not at home with the power structures of his day, one that, as Brendan Sutton pointed out in a much smaller sort of version of this, will probably be blocked by most of the leading lights of the Democratic Party, as an example, on Twitter, and very unlikely invited to opine on MSNBC and other sort of areas of the American establishment. And no doubt the ferocious racism and conspiracy theories that he faced from the right would continue up till this day. And don't forget, Ronald Reagan was very grudging when he signed the Martin Luther King Day Jr. holiday into law, and that holiday was voted against by John McCain, Orrin Hatch, Chuck Grassley, and others. But we do need to do this every year. We need to remind everybody what the man's politics actually were, connected to and building off the civil rights revolution that he was, of course, an instrumental part of. But here is a brief montage of him talking about labor inequality and poverty.
We must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
We read one day, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty and the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists.
Estimated that we spend $322,000 for each enemy we kill in Vietnam, while we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $53 for each person classified as poor. The promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home.
The other thing I want you to understand is this, that it didn't cost the nation one penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation one penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. Yes.
Of course, that was all correct. And of course, that was in the lead up to the assassination of Dr. King in Tennessee, where he was helping organize poor people's and labor campaigns in condition to a expansion of his work for civil rights. Now, we do know that in addition to very serious questions about FBI connections to his assassination, that this, of course, would be in concert with the rise of programs like COINTELPRO and the role of the FBI assassination in Black Panther leaders and other targeting by the FBI of these other groups as well. And now, this is very important because it's important to not only know exactly what we're talking about with Dr. King, but how this actually fits into a much broader American intellectual and political tradition, which is essentially African-American radicalism, socialist and otherwise, not only because it exemplified, of course, the leading edge of the battle for equal rights in this country, but also because it synchronized economic policies and conversations about labor and injustice, and it was globally oriented. W.E.B. Du Bois, in addition to being a communist, in addition to being an incredible academic in the United States, sought to draw connections between the United States and Africa. Malcolm X, in his political evolution before his assassination, had moved clearly into an anti-imperialist oriented politics, one verging towards socialism and one certainly drawing connections in liberated African nations, but also Cuba and even briefly China as well. Paul Robeson is another titan in this battle. He was an actor, attorney, football star, truly a Renaissance person in a way that's actually pretty unusual in all of American history. He was an uncompromising activist, and in his case, an uncompromising communist. Here he is in a foreshadowing, in fact, of the broader efforts that things like COINTEL would work towards. In the House Un-American Services Committee, of course, the McCarthyite project to destroy all radical Americans, not only people like Paul Robeson, but Hollywood screenwriters, State Department officials, and others. This is Robeson responding fearlessly to the committee. Matt, go ahead.
Just a brief, it's House Un-American Activities.
House Un-American, what did I say?
And Services.
And this is James.
My mistake.
And this is James Earl Jones reading the script.
And this is James Earl Jones reading the script. Paul Robeson in the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Could I be allowed to read from my statement?
Will you just tell this committee, please, while under oath, Mr. Robeson, the communists who participated in the preparation of that statement?
Oh, please. The reason I'm here today, from the mouth of the State Department itself, is I should not be allowed to travel because I have struggled for the independence of the colonial peoples of Africa. The other reason I'm here today, again, from the State Department and from the record of the Court of Appeals, is that when I am abroad, I speak out against injustices against the Negro people in this land. That is why I'm here. I'm not being tried for whether I'm a communist. I'm being tried for fighting for the rights of my people, who are still second-class citizens in this country, in this United States of America. My mother was born in your state, and my mother was a Quaker. My ancestors, in the time of Washington, baked bread for George Washington's troops when they crossed the Delaware. My father was a slave. I stand here struggling for the rights of my people to be full citizens in this country. And we are not. We are not in Mississippi. We are not in Montgomery, Alabama. We are not in Washington. We are nowhere. And that is why I'm here today. You want to shut up every Negro who has the courage to stand up and fight for the rights of his people, for the rights of workers. And I have been on many a picket line for the steel workers too. And
that's what it was. So when we reflect on MLK and we clearly assert the historical reality that this man was one of America's most important leaders in every sense of the word, and that there was actually some broad convergence between where a sort of Malcolm X project was heading in some respects, and certainly the actual radicalism of MLK, of Abernathy, of Baird Rustin, and others who were advocating a radical labor agenda in addition to the civil rights revolution. We should look at this broader activist and intellectual and political history of the United States, which exemplifies a left tradition that is all too often marginalized or, even worse, rebranded to try to prop some of the laziest narratives and capitalist affirmations of our present order. In addition to that, Mike Pence, MLK would certainly not be supporting you and your bosses.
Do the
Stupid.
wall through legislation.
Yeah. Do the wall through legislation. That's how we can do it through negotiation.
Both sides got to come together.
Both sides need to come to the table. That was an interesting pivot that we went through from MLK. It used to be right-wing MLK, but now Republican never Trumper MLK. I'm glad that he's not apologizing for America. However, he's been very tasteless. And how he's conducted himself with a lack of decorum in the White House. Read Mitt Romney's column.
He's like the one conservative that really likes what Shepard Smith does on Fox News.
I thought Shep in the 4 o'clock block saying that Guatemalans don't have rabies was very courageous. Now, this is very appropriate. We're going to get to the shout out in a second, but we need to play this here because speaking of MLK, COINTELPRO, and everything, frankly, which you could also track even to the FBI monitoring of people handing out leaflets against clear cutting, okay? And I'm not meaning that as an exaggeration. It's actually pretty extraordinary. This happened on Tucker Carlson the other night. Who's the name of this chap? Do we have this?
Terry Turchie.
Terry Turchie was a former FBI assistant director. Now, just so you know, I think, this is common knowledge of anybody who knows the history of institutions like the FBI, but you're not supposed to say this out loud.
You're supposed to get this from a book that you, only a few, 1,000 people read.
Right.
In the meantime, Terry Turchie was Deputy Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI, and he joins us tonight. Terry, we originally asked you to come on tonight to talk about border security, but before we do, I want to ask you your response to this back and forth between BuzzFeed and the special counsel's office. What's your take?
Sure, Tucker. Well, I'm a skeptic because of being in law enforcement, but I think it's kind of pretty simple. When you take the election and you take the House and you now convert all the committees that you have to investigating various aspects of the President of the United States, then your lifeblood has to be to react to stories. So you're going to see more stories planted so that all these committees can have a lot of work to do. And I think this is just more of the same. And I think we can expect more of this because, quite honestly, the electorate in some places is putting more and more progressives and self-described socialists in positions. And ironically, years ago when I first got into the FBI, one of the missions of the FBI in its counterintelligence efforts was to try and keep these people out of government. Why? Because we would end up with massive dysfunction and massive disinformation.
All right, I think that's what we need. So one other time, maybe we'll dissect the analysis around the BuzzFeed story and Democrats in Congress is silly. But the much bigger point here is Tucker Carlson, who's with Sean Hannity and all the other sort of water carriers for Trump, are always talking about these deep state conspiracies. Well, he just actually showed you what the actual American deep state looks like. The American deep state, maybe some of them might occasionally be offended by Donald Trump. They might even adamantly oppose Donald Trump and want to put somebody who can responsibly and competently administer American empire. But their historical purpose, as well as their present one, is to, quote unquote, keep these people out of power, which they have done through legal as well as illegal, extrajudicial, and in fact, at times, murderous means during the entirety of their history. So thank you, accidentally revealing Tucker Carlson's segment. By the way, he didn't do that on purpose, but for people who cape for Tucker Carlson and his fucking bullshit, that was a public service provided by Tucker Carlson's show.
Yeah.
That should be beamed into every home, on every phone, everywhere in America.
It's surreal to see that just stated like that. Because I remember reading Betty Metzger or something on the FBI and sort of how that stuff was uncovered. And it's just weird how this thing can sort of penetrate media attention. But as a sort of we never really deal with it. It just becomes something that you can have a knowing tone toward. This guy's yeah, everyone knows.
Yeah, I mean, everybody knew that. Well, it was something that they would have used to strenuously deny, and now it's become a truism.
Say there was some bad apples, basically.
Right.
And it's one of those things where, they talk about it, the FBI interventions, as if it's a thing of the past that was happening in the 60s. Having somebody come on today and say, like, this is literally what we were doing, 20 years ago or so, that's incredible, right?
That
to
is
say
incredible.
that it's still happening in the 90s
That's
and
like
2000s.
newsworthy, like breaking news almost.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I mean, it's happening. I mean, it's happening today on every level. From, we already know that the FBI still monitors, groups. There's been horrifying cases involving Black Lives Matter activists, as an example. And then even on the other end of the spectrum, we also know of like entrapment cases, essentially, of basically like, at times literally cognitively limited people who might be Muslim, essentially getting tricked into fake terrorism plots. We also know that people can absolutely still get on their radar frankly, if you went by a strict definition, you could include like watching a Noam Chomsky video on YouTube. It's, enormously dangerous and ongoing today.
Well, and you look at like privatization of the intelligence agencies, which we have like more and more. Like these are also sort of intelligence agencies, and there's a lot of these right wing, like they're off the books. They're not CIA, FBI, or anything. They're just some right wing oligarch money. But that whole system is way more developed now too than it was like years ago.
Yeah,
so
all these ancillary companies arose outside, especially after the sort of boom time of the war on terror. So you have everything from like, that's where some friggin' joke like Sebastian Gorka comes from. I mean, somebody like that was going around police departments and saying, this is how you deal with a threat. I mean, on some level, of course, it's a joke, but an incredibly dangerous fascistic joke, as are all of most of the headlines today. All right, let's get to the shout out. And for the shout out, DJ Danarchy has sampled somebody who's probably actually served as actually, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a Black Lives Matter activist who was harassed by legal authorities, and I should have gotten this story in front of me. I think he even did a bid. And the origin, I think, of what got him on the radar was an Alex Jones segment. So this stuff is very serious. Now, that said, let's go to the shout out.
Let's get to the shout out. Shout out, shout out. Creepy. Shout out, shout out, shout out. Weird. I think that's creepy. It's incredible. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out. This is crazy. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out. This is out of control. Shout out, shout out. That's creepy. Shout out, shout out. That's weird. Shout out, creepy. Shout out, weird. Shout out, crazy. Shout out, shout out. This is crazy. Shout out. This is out of control. Shout out. This is weird. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out.
Shout out goes to the small European nation of Luxembourg, which is set to become the first country to make all public transport free. This, of course, should be happening the world over, along with complete free and universal housing and healthcare. We need complete free, universal, high-quality transportation. I'm quoting now briefly from The Guardian. Luxembourg is set to become the first country in the world to make all of its public transport free. Fares on trains, trams, and buses will be lifted next summer under the plans of the re-elected coalition government led by Xavier Bettel, who was sworn in for a second term as prime minister on Wednesday. Bettel, whose Democratic Party will form a government with the left-wing Socialist Workers' Party and the Greens, has vowed to prioritize the environment during a recent election campaign. Of course, this is another great thing about free public transportation, is it synchronizes an important social need of allowing everybody to get where they need to go for no money, as well as reducing other forms of travel like car travel, which is obviously essential for dealing with the global ecological crisis. Now, I tweeted this out because it's a cool story, and I got a response. Don't have it in front of me, but a guy who is a TMBS person who watches the show from Luxembourg, and he said that there is a problem here, that basically there isn't enough public transport infrastructure, like fleets aren't big enough. So that's going to be a problem they're going to have to deal with in implementation. Hopefully, part of the answer to this will be a ramp up in things like train construction, or even more modestly, things like hydrogen buses. But oftentimes, in fact, great ideas and important policies come from the periphery and migrate to the center, and Luxembourg is leading the way on free public transportation, which needs to be a universal goal. So shout out to the center-left coalition doing that in Luxembourg. All right. We are going to do a little bit of business here, a little bit of shout-out business, and then we're going to get to Daniel Bessner. All right, folks. Let's start with it's time to become a patron if you haven't already. This weekend, this one will be unlocked, actually. We're going to do a candidate guide, our second part. After the first one was Beto O'Rourke, second one's going to be Tulsi Gabbard, obviously with a really heavy focus on these far-right connections in India. That seems to be really the best kind of roadmap for understanding her politics and her candidacy. The following week, Ralph Leonard, brilliant Nigerian British writer, we just did a piece we just recorded that will be released next week on cosmopolitanism, CLR James, and a sort of multi-party argument against the chauvinist racism of the IDW, of the resurgent right. Very smart critique of identity politics and essentialist politics, and a sort of call for a way of a socialist global culture. Brilliant work, and also is going to have a big influence in my book that I'm doing for Zero Books on the IDW. Just 3-to-1 almost 2-to-1 content. The post game, like the post game tonight, you're going to want to be with us while we take your calls and Discord questions, while we play all this sound, while we do the gulag. That's fun as hell. And then the illicit histories and the primers give you a full, broad grounding for grappling with politics and building community today, which of course people do on our amazing active Discord channel, which has generated social actions and solidarity and people having a lot of fun on. Patreon.com/TMBS, Patreon.com/TMBS. Become a patron today. Getting close. Next month, I think we will cross our 2,000 goal. And then, of course, the food bucket challenge is on the horizon. We're definitely going to do something a lot more fun and less denigrating for the 3,000 goal. I don't know what that is going to be yet, but the 3,000 goal is definitely going to be different. But nonetheless, people have fun with that 2,000 goal. We're trying to figure out, and I'm even tempted to ask people to tweet at YouTube, because it makes no sense whatsoever why YouTube has not monetized us. It either has something to do, potentially even with a broader pivot maybe they're thinking of, but not only have we exceeded the analytics, in fact, for the amount of time we've been on YouTube, the fact that we're about to cross 23,000 subscribers and the average view we get on videos without much promotion.
We needed 1,000.
Yeah, we needed 1,000. So this is bizarre. Doesn't make any sense. And of course, like all of these companies, they're totally opaque and you can't talk to a real human being and their reasons are really vague. So here's what we're doing. And I've got to organize this. We've already gotten our first one. But we're going to do the only good idea that Dave Rubin has ever had, which is we're going to take basically one-off questions. If you do $5 or above hit on the PayPal, which you should, contribute to anyways. It's a link in the show, and it's basically just to get it so that at the very least we're not losing money on this, which we have been. This has been a loss leader for sure. We want to at least make that cross neutral. So look, obviously first priority, become a patron. If you are a patron, you can do this, but I'm definitely not asking you to do this. But for everybody else, just go in the link, drop us some cash so we can figure out what to do here. I want to also encourage everybody in the next couple of weeks, another major fundraising deadline for Nomiki Konst. This is a really important race. I really believe in it. The New York public advocate position is actually really important. And her getting up to what she needs in terms of publicly matching funds is what's going to get her on the debate stage and help cross her in the threshold so she can actually provide some of that for real great progressive leadership in New York City. We're very enthusiastic about that campaign. We have, I don't know in front of me, a couple dozen, maybe less, not many, tickets left to the live show on February 1st, which is going to be extraordinarily fun and highly planned. We did about 3 hours of planning yesterday, and more to come. Sketches. It's going to be a lot of fun. Go to the Bell House, get your tickets to the Michael Brooks show live show, February 1st. Next week, the show is going to be, in case the idiot does some type of address on Tuesday, we're not going to do a show on Tuesday because the Majority Report will cover that live, so we'll all be sort of there doing the Majority Report thing. But Thursday, we're going to have our show, but we're going to start a little earlier. We're going to start around 6. We're going to respond to whatever nonsense Trump puts forward, and then we're going to have the great Bill Fletcher Jr. is going to return, and we're going to talk about the legacy of the revolutionary Amilcar Cabral. I'm very excited about that conversation and to have Bill Fletcher Jr. returning. Join us, guys. Patreon.com/TMBS, Patreon.com/TMBS. We'll be right back with Daniel Bessner.
I hope that Democrats think about, themselves falling in love and somebody that can get their juices flowing and their love tank filled, but can also appeal to people like Bill Kristol and Ana Navarro.
How can you say that?
Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is crew Daniel Bessner. He's also a Pyle Professor of International Relations at the University of Washington. Daniel, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, of course. Always glad.
I want to start. We're going to hit a couple of themes here with this sort of general rubric of what would it look like to have some type of left foreign policy that might actually leave a positive footprint in the world. And I think this is interesting because, first and foremost, as Matt gets ready, Matt just opened like I'm going to a Beastie Boys show, 1990s Corona beer for this conversation. I just thought you should know. Let's get that up on camera for a second. I think that
That's
between
the same
that
for me.
and my tracksuit, we're really in a good mode for this conversation. I was setting a good setup, but whatever, fuck it. Daniel, thanks for being here.
Yeah, of course.
No, but I mean, look, what's good about this, and I think it's a place for us to navigate, is so much of the kind of revisionist work right now is the definitive break with the democratic foreign policy of the 80s and 90s. And I mean that, and of course, obviously, the Republican and neoconservative foreign policy and in just sort of arch reactionary foreign policy. But if you kind of look at 80s and 90s democratic foreign policy, which I would say was basically just continued through the Obama administration, but some version of, on one hand, sort of to some degree proving that you're quote unquote tough, and tough means endless military engagements abroad and willingness to bomb people, combined with specific concern areas. And I want to be really clear about this. It's not that, as an example, when we're going to get to this, I think, next week on the show, the Sudan is a good place to illustrate this point. I'll get to you in a second. Omar al-Bashir is one of the most, he is in fact he's a brutal dictator. He's committed numerous crimes against humanity. And as Nasreen Malik pointed out, she said, several years ago when it was the Obama era and George Clooney and Darfur, this was at the top of the agenda. Now that it's a vicious repression of labor unrest and student protests, it's not on the radar at all. So the critique of that humanitarian interventionist mindset is not only that most of those humanitarian interventions ended catastrophically like Libya, but also that, when on one hand you're presiding over empire and then on the other hand discoursing human rights, it's pretty incoherent. So maybe before we get to how we're going to apply it, I mean, first tee off on that legacy and remind everybody how you and we are breaking from it.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this has been something that goes back really, I would say it started really in the Vietnam War, when one of the reasons that Lyndon Johnson escalated in Vietnam in 1964, 1965 was for fear of being criticized as being insufficiently, basically masculine, for lack of a better word, being insufficiently a man with regards to the intervention in Vietnam, and he feared for his domestic political future. And this really became a trend for Democrats for Vietnam until really Obama. The idea that you needed to be tough on foreign policy issues and that being tough was defined by military intervention. And this really came to a fore, as you suggested, after the Cold War, when the United States was so obviously the most powerful nation in the world, no longer feared a Soviet nuclear attack, and was really able to do what it wanted all over the globe. And you got Madeleine Albright, for example, famously calling the United States the indispensable nation. And so, of course, as listeners may or may not remember, there were a series of genocides over the course of the 90s, particularly in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Rwanda, and that the United States did some things, and some of them didn't do some things and others. But it eventually leads to a law professor, formerly a journalist, named Samantha Power, writing a book in 2002 called The Problem from Hell, where she essentially argued that the United States, if it was truly so powerful and if it was truly so indispensable, needed to militarily intervene in the affairs of other nations when the other nations were committing human rights abuses. And most famously, this policy is enacted, I think, in response to during Libya, supposedly to stop a massacre in Benghazi. Of course, there were many other reasons. You can't just reduce these interventions to one single cause. But I do think that American foreign policymakers did believe that they were using military force for good in Libya. Again, a number of other reasons, but that was one of the reasons. So the question that I think is raised for leftists who want to eventually hold power, for example, when Bernie Sanders comes to office, is what are they going to do if they totally reject military intervention, as I do, right? Is there a true left-wing commitment to particular rights, particular human rights, but I would just say not even human rights, but really left-wing ideas and ideologies about liberty, about equality, things that, that are really important? What do you do if you totally reject military intervention, but you're nonetheless the head of the American state? And this was a question that I was trying to think through, at least in this piece I wrote for The Nation on the Uyghur concentration camps in China. And that's sort of where we are. And I don't have all the answers, but I think it's an interesting question, and we could get into why I think it's interesting if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I'd like to. And I just also want to just another sort of data point, particularly, I mean, everybody from, on a more important level, but even on in a kind of public intellectual level, Tony Blair and Christopher Hitchens deployed a lot of human rights rhetoric in service of the invasion of Iraq, and were actually
nefarious.
Yeah, and that was a major force, and certainly in the Democratic side, but also people who were, emerging pundits and journalists and so far, and so forth, in supporting that, horrific endeavor. You have this piece in The Nation. It's called "How the Left Should Respond to Ethnic Cleansing in China." Millions of Uyghurs are being held in concentration camps. What can the U.S. do? You co-wrote it with Isaac Stone Fish. Now, before we get to that, I gotta note that, I mean, when I put this out there was definitely some responses. I think there was a piece in the Gray Zone Project questioning the validity of the reporting on basically the concept. And I think this is actually important, because it's one thing if the specific, very alarming, terrifying idea of there being concentration camps comes into doubt, which I'm not sure it does. I'm going to throw to you in a second. But that being said, I just want to say, for a kind of larger principle here, nobody who has any credibility, including, the people who have, maybe wrote a good piece to undermine that specific piece of reporting, nobody is questioning that Uyghurs are treated extremely poorly by the People's Republic of China. And one could also, certainly add the occupation of Tibet and any number of other areas where there's very robust Chinese human rights abuses. And again, I feel, I'm anticipating a certain type of annoying blowback. So I'll, as always, stipulate that the United States and France and Russia, I mean, any imperial actor with any weight to throw around the world is committing massive abuses of human beings as a matter of reality.
And also the number of people we incarcerate is inconscionable. No one's claiming that the United States has a perfect moral record.
Right.
And no one would ever claim that. And I am certainly not claiming that. And we should focus on those issues first. That I'm not saying any of that. The major reason, though, is that if the left is serious about governing and having policies, we're going to get asked these questions.
Right.
We live in a democracy, and I think that we need to build democratic consensus for policies. I'm not a Leninist. I'm not a revolutionary. And so the left is certainly going to be asked about humanitarian intervention by the liberals, with whom they will undoubtedly be in a coalition with. And many of these liberals will also undoubtedly staff many of the national security institutions in the Sanders administration, because there just aren't enough leftists. So it's also important just to take the practical issues that we need to start having and formulating and thinking through answers to the problems of foreign policy that don't just redound to America is evil and America is bad and America is imperialist, which, even though this is true in a lot of regards, it's not enough if we actually want to wield power. So I don't want to deny any of that. I would never deny any of that. It's actually really critical to understand that the United States does a lot of evil in the world, has done a lot of evil in the world, and also does a lot of evil domestically as well. So I just think they're almost separate questions, even though they've been treated in left-wing thought as kind of equivalent, that to even talk about what the left could do to promote its own ideals in the world is to be necessarily imperialist. And I appreciate that critique, and I'm sympathetic with it, but I just don't think that the conversation could end there, especially if we want to actually govern it and do things in the world, even as we basically reduce America's military footprint, get rid of the hundreds of bases that we have, completely get rid of the Defense Department's budget and all of those things. The fact of the matter is the United States is still an enormously important power, probably the most important power in the world. And the revolution is probably not going to come tomorrow. So there's going to be a transition period where the United States does have significant power in the world. And what does a governing left do with that power? Is there a way to promote truly left-wing goals without militarily intervening in someone, without supporting dictators, without doing horrible things, and also without basically sparking a new Cold War with China? right? Even though China does have all these human rights abuses, I don't think we should fight a Cold War with them by any stretch of the imagination, right? But does that mean then we ignore Uyghur concentration camps? And know what? Some people might say that does mean we ignore Uyghur concentration camps, and I think that's a defensible position. It's not necessarily one that I would endorse for a variety of reasons, but I think this is something that we need to at least be talking about, and we can't just have the knee-jerk, we can't ever do anything response.
Right. I mean, because you made this critique before, right? That even a lot of things that are, that are great, like, I mean, if you grew up learning about U.S. foreign policy by reading Noam Chomsky, you'd be in a better starting point to understand how the world works than 99% of other things. But at the same time, it wouldn't really give you anything for figuring out how to actually govern. So what is the answer? I mean, first of all, just to be clear, you are satisfied with the reporting on the concentration camp specifically, and at the very least, there is a very serious crisis of treatment of Uyghurs in China. What is the leftist non-new Cold War response to that? What do you guys outline in the Nation piece?
Right. So just in terms of the reporting, I mean, just to be completely honest, I'm not an expert on this. And I know Ben Norton, who I believe is one of the reporters of that piece, is a great reporter. And I'm not going to go against him. But from what I've seen, as an admittedly non-expert in this, it does seem that at the very least that there are horrible, surveillance being done against the Uyghurs. They have to live with agents. The agents are constantly reporting on them. It's very anti-Islamic and very anti-Turk. Right. And I think the question goes to the number of Uyghurs that are actually incarcerated in concentration camps. And this is, of course, something that should be reported out. And I'm not going to go against or go for it because I'm not a reporter on the ground in Xinjiang. But I think that it's also it's important as a thought experiment to think through what types of tools would a left-wing government consider to be legitimate and what types of tools would they consider to be illegitimate. And so I think what we basically recommended in the piece, just to really talk about it in brief, is that we said military intervention's off the table, that we could never militarily intervene, either through direct military intervention, which obviously the United States would never do with China because it doesn't want to spark World War III, but even the types of Syrian interventions where you have the militarization of the conflict by giving weapons to a particular group. I think that 9 times out of 10, maybe even 9.9 times out of 10, that always results in something terrible. And so it's not something that's a military intervention is really not something to be pursued. So we essentially recommend 2 things. The first part is essentially using diplomacy as a means to pressure China on the international stage through a variety of mechanisms, whether it's making China's Muslim neighbors aware of what's going on, or maybe trying to force them to publicly condemn Beijing, something along those lines. So basically using diplomacy as a tool of statecraft. And I think this is actually a pretty interesting conversation because there seems to be, and maybe I'm wrong, but there seems to be a fuzziness of thinking on the left, namely, is diplomacy a legitimate tool of international relations, right? With President Bernie, is President Bernie allowed to use the State Department to promote left-wing goals, to promote socialist goals and humanist goals, et cetera? And I think some people would say, again, legitimately, I see where they're coming from, that you can never use the tools of a necessarily imperial state to do anything good, and that the only thing you could do is sort of get rid of those tools. And that's one side of the argument. However, I'm of the opinion that you could do things, again, like public shaming and diplomatic action to try to at least attenuate it seems to be, at least from what we can tell in terms of reporting, the very serious abuses being done against the Uyghurs. So that was solution 1. And solution 2, which is frankly the solution I think a lot of people on both sides of the left spectrum could agree with, is basically funding Uyghur resettlement as much as humanly possible, so that instead of basically ignoring the question of refugees or doing what the United States has done now and has done for a while, which is incarcerate refugees, we can actually use the immense wealth that we have in this country from taxing the rich with their 95% marginal tax rate. I think AOC is going to come out in favor of something larger, hopefully soon enough, but use the capital that we have in this country to actually resettle and help these people without directly intervening in Chinese politics, so that you're essentially not sparking a new Cold War. So those are the 2 solutions: diplomacy and refugee resettlement, and that's what we recommended.
Yeah, I mean, a whole subtext of even this situation in Syria, which to me I thought it was important intellectually to get it right in some ways, and I loathed people who would sort of downplay Assad's crimes, but of course I also opposed intervention, and I have loathed U.S. adventurism and essentially all of the multi-party factions from the United States to Russia to the Gulf to Assad and all of these criminal syndicates essentially. But the one piece missing from the conversation that was just so stunningly obvious was just a massive. I mean, if the United States put the budget that they'd put into funding Salafist groups and bombing civilians into relocating, refugees, while they actually could engage in some type of real diplomatic process of the type that somebody like, Thabo Mbeki was advocating several years ago, saying from the perspective of like, look, I literally negotiated peace with people who were murdering and gassing me and my comrades and my people, so of course, like, the reality of diplomacy in any part of the world, and I think, this is something that doesn't sit well with a lot of people across the political spectrum, is that you're going to need to make agreements with a wide variety of people, including some, really heinous ones. That's just how it is. But that basic reframe of how about we start just from the ground point of getting the money and the resources to the people who need it, as an example, the Uyghurs, right?
Right, and I think that's exactly right, and I think this is really the ethical question that the left, when it governs, it seems like it's actually going to govern, really needs to confront, because essentially the ship of state was not built by a socialist, right? So that you have a different ethics, basically governing an international relation. So that what do you do in the international sphere when you sit in the seat of the world's largest superpower? Right, and the world's largest superpower that, of course, has a number of domestic problems, but also, frankly, I think at least is essentially responsible for the structure of the world as it exists today. The United States never built a liberal international order. It may be said it built an illiberal international order, but it certainly did build the international order that exists today, beginning in 1945. So the question, I think, really boils down to is, do you reject diplomacy as such? Because diplomacy as such, when you're President Bernie, using the State Department, is it necessarily imperial, or do you not? And if you don't, then you have to start thinking about creative ways to try to promote equalitarian, egalitarian, and humanist values abroad without slipping down the slide toward humanitarian intervention. And it's actually, military intervention, which has essentially been humanitarian intervention, has essentially been defined by military intervention. And it's a really, really difficult question. And I certainly don't have the answers, but I think that this knee-jerk response is just not going to be satisfactory for a number of reasons, particularly in terms of coalition building and particularly in terms of the ethics of actually governing the United States.
Right, no doubt. I want to spend a few minutes on Brazil, and then briefly, before you go, touch on the significance, really big significance of this Michelle Alexander piece on getting real about Palestine. But before we go there, I mean, I want to loop back in on Brazil, which I've obviously covered extensively on this show, and just a couple of things. I mean, one, it seems to me that from the reframe of what you're talking about, which is that if we say, first of all, get the resources to people who need it first and foremost, and then secondly, let's talk about, and we're running a little footage here in the background. This is, we're definitely going to get to Lula, the political prisoner who definitely, him being removed from the chessboard is, absolutely a primary reason that this fascist regime is in power in Brazil. But we'll get to that in a second. But starting more broadly, a couple of weeks into this new government, which was backed by all sorts of Western capital interests, literally endorsed by the Wall Street Journal, backed by every type of U.S. and Canadian conglomerate that wants to exploit Brazil imaginable. Bolsonaro and his justice minister, Sergio Moro, the guy who persecuted and hounded Lula and basically, has worked for several years to criminalize the left in Brazil. They're in Davos essentially saying, the paraphrase is like, I don't care if you call me homophobic, I'm not corrupt. Well, in the last couple of weeks, there's been stories of corruption involving Bolsonaro's son that is sort of like just breathtaking, like just even on the level of like, you guys didn't think maybe you should do this a little bit more intelligently than direct deposits if you're going to run a whole campaign supposedly that you're, clean. Even more ominously, there's now reporting linking the Bolsonaro political organization with the mafia that assassinated Marielle Franco, which, shouldn't surprise anyone. This is a vicious, cruel, dangerous Brazilian government. And they've taken aim out of the gate at indigenous people, labor, LGBTQ, and so on. And so from the perspective of like what a President Bernie would do, okay, it wouldn't be like, nobody's talking about invading Brazil, obviously. But conversely, would a conversation that implicates Bolsonaro be a good example of flipping a humanitarian impulse versus a human rights intervention? Because human rights interventions were always focused on behavior that was obviously totally unacceptable, but also like the most extreme. Samuel Moyn made this point, right? Like there isn't that many places in the world, thankfully, that actually are committing like ethnic cleansing as an example. Now, of course, it needs to be responded to, no doubt. And maybe Bolsonaro will get there. Actually, arguably, his policies on the Amazon do amount to ethnic cleansing of indigenous people. But short of that, I mean, but even just more broadly, like, even before he came to power, the austerity measures of the Michel Temer government brought hunger back into reality, which the Workers' Party had eliminated. Like, what does that look like in terms of like taking on something that is now a U.S. corporate client state, exactly the type of regime the U.S. would install in its imperial history? And now if you had a socialist government in the United States that wanted to exert pressure but not revert to bullying imperial tactics, but of course put pressure on Bolsonaro and the companies here that support him, in fact, and maybe that's the real answer, what would we do?
Right. I think what you said at the end, of course, I think it's totally legitimate for a left-wing government to sanction American companies. And even if they wanted to, I think legitimate to sanction international countries that do business or aid in the persecution of what Bolsonaro is doing. So I think that's an obvious one that I think most on the left would agree with because we're anti-capitalist. The more difficult problem comes in when you start talking about building something like Bernie talked about with the Progressive International, right? Let's say Corbyn wins in the UK and then the United States and the UK form some sort of progressive international coalition and they try to build up essentially what it would be is diplomatic pressure to sanction and morally sanction, but also to hopefully have some sort of specific effect on the material realities of the Bolsonaro administration and their ability to govern. Would that be considered legitimate by the left wing, right? Because that's using basically the tools of statecraft to intervene in some serious regards in the sovereignty of another nation. Now, that other nation might be fascist and we might be against it, but is that considered to be a legitimate tool? And I think these are the questions that we really need to be talking about. So the positive of that is that, of course, the United States and the UK are very powerful nations and that they'll be able to possibly force pressure. The negative of that is that does this create a precedent that allows, for example, the next Donald Trump or the next Mitt Romney or the next whoever it may be, George W. Bush, to also build now a conservative international where they would be able to advocate against left-wing interests. And I think that's the difficulty, not saying that you wouldn't want to build international pressure because I think you would want to, but these are the sort of difficulty, unintended consequences type things that we need to think about. And this is why I think it's important for when we start talking about foreign policy, especially going forward, just as people who think about these things, both professionally, but also as any regular guy or girl who does this, who's interested in it, thinks about, is what is the role of civil society groups, particularly left-wing civil society groups, in building the types of transnational solidarities that were first articulated by Marx in the 19th century, but never really came to powerful fruition in the 20th and 21st centuries. So, for example, what is the SEIU's foreign policy? Right. So what are American labor unions' foreign policies, and what are their connections to workers abroad? Now, traditionally, American labor unions, as probably everyone listening to this knows, has been pretty conservative with protecting American wages, protecting American jobs, and looking ways to protect their domestic constituencies. And of course, this makes a lot of sense. I don't need to go into it. But the question is, as we go forward into the 21st century, and it becomes ever more clear that the global networks that were created in the last 125 years aren't going to go way is if we could actually build transnational imaginaries that unite workers across borders, which is, of course, the original dream of Marxism. And the question is, how do you do that? And then the question is it good to do that through the state, or is it better to do it through civil society organizations like unions? And I think this is just really a fertile area for imaginative thought that I think once we get beyond the knee-jerk anti-imperial critique, which is, of course, like you said, if you read Chomsky, you'll understand the world better than 99% of people who don't read Chomsky. But we need to get beyond that critique and start thinking in these sorts of ways and what types of mechanisms we could use to actually promote our goals.
Specifically on Lula, and I mean, it's funny, you mentioned that, and we wanted to talk specifically about Lula for a couple of minutes because actually the AFL-CIO did send a delegation several months ago, and they were rallying for their worker party's colleagues. They were holding Lula Livre signs. I think there actually has been some progress in that regard, with just the realities of globalization and also the new political attitudes injecting themselves. This is somebody who, I always say is the most prominent political prisoner in the world. And also, I just think objectively, in terms of the, taking 30 million people out of poverty, conservative estimate, the most successful president of the 21st century. But he's also exemplifies a broader criminalization of left leaders, certainly across Latin America. I think that there's some signals here that, there's certainly parallels of what Erdogan has done to the HDP Kurdish opposition in Turkey. So it seems to me that in addition to the innate importance of the case, as well as the U.S. role in supporting this horrific, disgusting Sergio Moro figure who persecuted Lula and now serves as justice minister in this Bolsonaro regime, that the imprisonment of Lula and the exposure of so many people from the judiciary of Brazil, the military of Brazil, the Clinton-Obama State Department, that we need to get this out there. This needs to be something that's certainly not just the great, Bernie's, of course, talked about it because he's better on these things, but anybody who wants a Democratic nomination needs to have something to say about the crisis in terms of Bolsonaro, but also the broader sort of attack on pink tide governments and the political persecution and lawfare of Lula because we helped support it.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think something like what President Bernie should do is in the first 10 days do something like demand Lula's freedom. Right. I think that's a legitimate moral call that the President of the United States is uniquely able to make. And I think that things like that are things that are really important to do, which is to take a moral stance and essentially say that we're not going to allow the illegal persecution of leftists throughout Latin America. And particularly, as you said, we kind of broke the entire continent and have for a long time. And so that there's actually also a moral responsibility to do things like demand Lula's freedom and work for progressive goals throughout the continent. So I think that's something that's absolutely legitimate and something that needs to be done. And I think exactly what you said is exactly right, in the sense that this is really a campaign of popularization and letting people just know what's going on in the world. And this is why I think one of the most important things a left-wing foreign policy could do is actually declassify information, right? Yeah. Let people know what the State Department knows about Brazilian politics and history, right? Let the Brazilian people know. Let the people of Latin America know what's going on, because we have this enormous data gathering basically class of organizations that is able to do that. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that the CIA is also one of those data gathering organizations, and that has done enormous damage in the world and will no doubt continue to do enormous damage in the world. And it just highlights the complexities of these questions and that there's really no easy answers, unfortunately. But we have to live with the world as it is. And I think left-wing governments or left-wing presidential administration would need to think about what elements of like the diplomacy that it would want to keep and what elements of the awful national security state it would want to get rid of, which I think is probably most elements, frankly, of the national security state, but then also what sort of minimal data gathering informational bodies that it would want so that people know what goes on in Brazil. And more importantly than Americans knowing this, so that Brazilians are able to know what are behind the machinations of their, for example, fascist leader today.
100%. And I want to say, I think we have a link to it that we could put up on screen for a second, but there's one of the campaigns now that the Free Lula movement in Brazil has been pushing for is to get him nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for eliminating hunger in Brazil. And I would recommend, I mean, I've signed this, and I think, I'm very skeptical of collectivism, but I think signing this petition on change.org to nominate Lula for a Nobel Peace Prize is actually a very effective and very smart way of this civil society campaign, both for, look, a very good leader and someone who's been horrifically prosecuted. And really at the point, I just want to underscore, like, I don't trust anything. I mean, any new information that you get coming out about Lula from this Brazilian government now, I mean, let alone even the last several years, which have already been illegitimate with the process, that the coup that removed Dilma. But I mean, now we literally have in Sergio Moro a guy who is saying no comment to corruption stories that are happening right now about the Bolsonaro family, and has said, one of his intentions was to figure out corruption in Brazil's labor unions. This is all politicized, and it's no surprise that Forbes magazine and Bloomberg and others, as well as, I mean, very depressingly, but I guess not surprisingly, the New York Times and the Guardian, they're reporting on this has been atrocious, and basically just kind of funneled stuff from U.S. trade associations. So I would sign that and encourage everybody. I have, and I'd encourage everybody to as well. The last thing I want to touch on with you, I'll just tee it up for you. Michelle Alexander, of course, wrote The New Jim Crow. She's a very important author. She wrote, and she's now, I mean, this is finally, I mean, my God, somebody at the New York Times worth reading. She just wrote a piece that came out this weekend called Time to Break the Silence on Palestine. Martin Luther King Jr. courageously spoke out about the Vietnam War. We must do the same when it comes to this grave injustice of our time. Michael Orn, the Israeli, the former, ambassador, and just a, kind of arch Likudnik with good TV presenter skills, actually said that this column was a strategic threat to Israel. Was it?
Certainly not. And I think what you're seeing is the opening of a discursive space for the first time since Israel was founded in 1948 of a mainstream American liberal discourse to criticize the Israeli occupation, and particularly the Israeli treatment of Palestinians, both within Israel proper and also in the occupied territories, which of course Israel in the West Bank at least has expanded with settlements. So you're seeing essentially the outcome, I think, of the Netanyahu strategy, which was to no longer essentially rely on the American Jewish community to support Israel, but was to move toward American evangelical Christians to support Israel, which has actually been a really successful strategy to build basically definite support for Israel amongst the Republican Party and amongst American conservatives. So with the success of that strategy, you're actually seeing the blowback amongst in liberal journals, places like the New York Times, where they would allow Michelle Alexander, even though she's a columnist, I'm sure an editor could have theoretically killed it. They would allow someone like Michelle Alexander to actually publish a piece that argues in favor of recognizing what Israel is doing with regards to Palestine and Palestinians. So it's truly an enormous shift. And in the sense that you see the widening of the famous Overton window, which has been a left-wing critique since at least the 1970s, if not earlier, of Israeli policy, is now becoming accepted amongst mainstream liberals. So it's an enormous positive shift, of course, obviously, but I think it betokens these deeper shifts in the Israeli-American relationship, and particularly who now supports Israel. Like Michael, I don't know if you've ever driven through the great mountain west of this country or the American South, but there's many posters, rather strikingly, that advocate for people, for example, in Arkansas or Idaho to support Israel, right? And so you see a complete political shift, a strategic shift amongst the Likud party that is now essentially coming back to bite it in the ass in some regard, amongst the elites, liberal elites who in the past were very, very quote unquote pro-Israel, by that meaning unwilling to criticize the treatment of Palestinians, or at least to make that the focus of the American-Israeli relationship.
Yeah, and it's interesting because people like, Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, they correctly on some level said, look, if we are an apartheid state indefinitely, and those guys did use the word apartheid way before it was used here by, people in positions of some influence, even though, it's objectively apartheid. But that being said, they said, look, you're going to lose basically liberal Jewish people and younger people. And as you say, I mean, the calculation has been by Netanyahu, well, what about the far right in America? And I think that's also coalesced with the other switching reality that, Israel is a Tea Party nation now. And I think it, it complicates because on one hand, I mean, look, of course, at least going back to 1967 and the occupation, Israel has been, in this horrific domineering position of Palestinians, and going back to the very founding of Israel obviously involved displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the Nakba. But conversely, you can't be an essentialist about, Israel either. This narrative of Israel is just this like unchanging one-dimensional state is also profoundly not true because now you're dealing with a place. Yeah, I mean, it's like, I think you're right. I think it's like, well, we've American evangelicals here and we can do deals with China and Russia who don't, bother us and don't have a civil society to bother us about this stuff. And that sort of old school, kind of like Zionist liberal thing for all of the abuses and racisms and hypocrisies, it's gone and it's been replaced by something else.
And I think, and just to give a personal background, like I'm Jewish, and not only am I Jewish, Michael, I'm a serious Jew. I went to Jewish day school my entire life. And so I grew up in sort of what might be considered, Israel was great. All the maps didn't have the occupied territories. In my school, we sometimes said the Israeli national anthem in addition to the American national anthem. So I'm someone who should have been, on Israel's side, right? But the argument just doesn't hold up. Basically, I think, not to put too crude a point on it, but the Holocaust is too far away for that to serve as a cover for Israel, which is, I think, what it did for many decades between the 1940s and roughly the 1990s. And I understand why that trauma would have had that effect on liberal American Jews, many of whom lost families. We talked about that a bit in previous discussions about Hans Speyer, but basically the argument just doesn't work any longer, particularly amongst liberal American Jews, particularly amongst young liberal American Jews, who I think most young American Jews are, in fact, liberal. So you're seeing this strategic move on the behalf of the Likud government to move away from American Jews. But you're also seeing, like you said, with the emergence of what I think are truly the first post-Cold War alliances, like you had the last 27 years since the Cold War roughly ended until Trump, 89 to 2016. But now you're seeing the creation of these sorts of new alliances where Israel is kind of allying with Saudi Arabia and kind of allying with India, right? And so you're having a constellation of these new geopolitical arrangements, which I think we're just really living through for the first time. And it'll be really interesting to see where the United States falls. Because right now with Trump, it's clearly in that camp, right? Trump is very positive toward Modi. He's very positive toward Netanyahu. He's very positive, obviously, toward Mohammed bin Salman, et cetera. But what does President Bernie do, right? And that'll change everything. But the only difference is it's not the Cold War where the United States had a governing logic that would be that for better, for more or less, for better, mostly for worse, but more or less defined U.S. relations with the rest of the world for much of the 20th century, and there's no longer that sort of governing logic in U.S. foreign policy. So it'll be interesting to see what all these nations do when Trump loses.
Daniel Bessner, as always, it's a huge pleasure. Of course, many conversations between us ahead, some articles between us ahead, and he's coming in studio in March, and he'll be wearing his own tracksuit.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, folks, here's what we're going to do. Of course, Griscom is going to do his economic minute, but we're gonna experiment. We're going to basically have Corey Pein coming on the line for about the last 20 minutes, 30 minutes of the show before we go to the post game and see what it's like. Because, I mean, basically just, like Waz and Corey, it's just a bummer that they're not in New York. I wish they could be in studio, so we're just going to experiment, just having Corey on the line while we do the Griscom segment and we kibitz a little bit. First, of course, we're going to talk a little bit about a group called the RSS and the BJP with Corey, which is good context for understanding, actually, in a much bigger sense, Indian foreign policy, where India is today, but also all of the controversy and weirdness around the whole Tulsi Gabbard thing. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take another quick break and come right back with Corey Pein. Fucking Danarchy, bro. Joining us now is Corey Pein. He's host of a great podcast. People should become a patron of it. News from Nowhere. I was just actually on this past episode. Connor Habib, who will be a guest on this show soon, hopefully was a guest on recently. Corey's, of course, also a journalist. He's the author of the excellent book, Live, Work, 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 Die, A Journey to Savage Heart, Silicon Valley. He's a regular on TMBS. He's a fucking smart guy. Corey, you're great. Did you find the weed?
Introduction. Yeah, the shortage is coming to an end, I think, here in Canada.
Okay.
It's good news. I can report from the frozen north.
I can report. I like how you use that verbiage for that. Like, this reporter can tell you that he's vaping.
You know that I will always disclose any like flagrant conflicts of interest when I come on your show, unlike Tucker Carlson.
What are some of Tucker's flagrant conflicts of interest, Corey?
Well, you know, Tucker is not even really the worst anymore. It's really Jake Tapper who has infuriated me today.
Right.
You know, with his putting out this statement from these kids and, well, their PR shop and pretending like it's from them.
Right.
That was like, I know we're going to be talking about the history of Hindu nationalism, but I just want to say my piece about this for a second.
Yeah, go ahead. Go off, King.
Basic violation of journalistic ethics to have a contributor to your show who is also a PR guy supply a statement that you then pretend is like from a figure in the news. Like basically I'm mixing them up now. Jake Tapper's contributor, like one of his employees, wrote where that story was going to go next, and he pretended like that's not what happened. So I'd like to use this platform to get other journalists who might be listening pissed off about that.
Wait, but spell that out. Because I haven't.
Okay.
So what exactly did Jake Tapper do, and who is this person?
So Tapper tweeted out a statement which he said was from the kid that was in the video, smirking and intimidating the Native American man at the mall.
Okay, so this is the video that everybody was.
Big story, right? Everybody saw the video,
Everybody's
and
talking
then there
about
was
this.
pushback about, maybe those boys from the Catholic school actually felt threatened. which was the gist of a statement that that Jake Tapper. I know it's done. Now that I screwed it up once, I'm gonna keep doing it. That Jake Tapper put out on Twitter, and he said, "Oh, here's a statement from the student, the main kid." Except it wasn't from the main kid. One of the local newspapers in Kentucky figured out that it was this PR guy, Republican PR guy, who also happens to be a contributor on Jake Tapper's show.
So an on-air contributor is the dude from the PR shop in Kentucky, and Tapper was like, "Heads up, there's going to be a statement that is presumably written by this kid, but it turns out it's written by a PR shop, and the PR shop is a person who's a commentator on his show." Okay, yep.
Does that follow?
Yeah, that follows. That does not surprise me in any way.
I mean, it's kind of inside ball, but like journalistically speaking, that is like not good. Right?
No, that's like really not
honest.
good. Dude, I think these stories always, I actually think that things like Jake Tapper's conduct end up being the most important thing about these things in a way. Like I think like it's so revelatory of just the utter bankruptcy of these practices. Corey, though, because I want you to tell us, just lay it out. What is the RSS and how does it connect to the BJP, which is, of course, the party that currently governs India? What are these things?
Okay. I think probably it's the best way in is through a bit of history. And
can I say just really quick, I should have set this up. You've lived in India. So in addition to covering this, like this is actual, like you have some experience on the ground with this stuff.
Well, not only I didn't live there very long. I don't want to overstate like my expertise, right? And I don't speak Hindi or Urdu or any of the dominant languages in South Asia. But I did live in Bihar, which is a rural state, for a while, and my wife, who is a scholar of Sanskrit and Tantra, was teaching at a university there. So, credit to her. But not only did we live there for a while, her longer than me, because of her work.
She's a dope academic.
Her name's Patricia Southoff. Because of her
Check
work,
her out.
We ended up being targeted by the RSS in a certain way. And now, so just putting my cards on the table.
Right.
The RSS, there's not really a comparison or analogy for it in American politics, unless you count, say, the Ku Klux Klan. But that's not even a good one-to-one comparison either. And I think we need to start not by just explaining what the RSS is, but by explaining its ideology, which is sort of shorthand. You can describe it as Hindutva. And that's not the same as Hinduism, right? Hinduism is a religion practiced by a lot of people. Hindutva is more like a political ideology, a kind of ethnic and religious nationalism that promotes, I guess, the simplest way of putting it is a sort of quasi-fascist vision of the Hindu Rashtra, like the Hindu nation. And the main organization that puts out that ideology and embraces it is the RSS, which, I'll butcher the pronunciation, is an acronym for Rashtriya Swamsevik Sangh, or, you could describe it as, translated as National Patriotic Organization, which should set off some alarm bells.
A lot of bells.
Based on the name.
Right. Yeah. That's anytime you got a name like National Patriotic, yada, blah, 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 this is bad shit. Whether we're talking about, that's a universal. United States, Hungary, India, Kenya, Jamaica, China, Russia. That's a bad name.
Well, yeah. And its relationship to the ruling party in India, the BJP, or the Bharatiya Janata Party, like People's Party, is something of a hierarchical one in which the RSS is on top. And we're talking about an organization that's really a paramilitary organization. You can think of it like a militia group of about 6 million people, really steering the activities of a party that controls the government and has 100+ million people in it. and it's tied again to this sort of casteist, elitist vision of Hinduism and its role in politics. So we're not necessarily talking about mainstream religious activity here. We're talking about a political interpretation of religious nationalism.
Yeah, this is really important. I mean, we're going to have, we'll get into this more later. This Sunday, we're going to be speaking with a really good reporter from The Intercept on this and the Tulsi Gabbard candidacy. But I just wanted to say, before we open it up, I think there's just two really important things about this. One is this understanding of this fascist movement in India, which is obviously specifically relevant to understanding Tulsi Gabbard and where she's coming from and the specific dangers of her candidacy. It should be a doorway into, certainly on this show, more broad coverage of India. It should be a doorway to know that also India has some incredibly successful Marxist politics, even as an example, like the state of Kerala that was, governed by electoral moderate Marxists, delivered, massive social advances across the board relative to other states in India. And also, of course, that, yes, I mean, ironically, in these conversations, like, I'm the guy, like, I have a lot of sympathy for Hindu spirituality is how I'll put it. And there's a lot of manifestations of Hindu spirituality and a lot of manifestations of, political, philosophic, religious traditions here. I mean, going back to even like someone like Amartya Sen, who wrote a great book called The Argumentative Indian, he had very sound both sort of philosophical and, of course, also historical critiques of these ideas from the perspective of basically a kind of cosmopolitan liberal Hindu perspective. So that's, I think, one thing that's really important to put on the table, both just in terms of like enlarging the whole India conversation, but also number two, like a lot of people have kind of said like, oh, like why is it, what is this like special focus on her? Because, is it some form of like anti-Hindu bigotry? And I would say like, here, let's break it down. Unfortunately, there's conspiracy theories like this all the time that are never true. But you know what? If you could establish a clear connection between, let's do two examples: a Muslim candidate and a Salafist preacher, promoting, a form of Sunni extremism, and you could actually say like, no, this person has the same funding base and is also drawing from the same spiritual teachers. This is their philosophic base. Yes, that's a very reasonable thing to look at. If somebody was a Buddhist, but not just Buddhist, not just Hindu or Muslim or Jewish, but Buddhist and specifically had a pipeline connection to Buddhist monks calling for ethnic cleansing of Rohingyas in Burma, yes, you would very specifically go and study that through line. Like, generically, I think it's, great. It would be better to have more atheists, but also more Hindus, more Jewish people, more, a broader array of people in American politics. That's great. But when you have this specific set of connections, whether it be, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, whatever. I mean, we already know Christian, obviously, dominant ideology is this far-right Christian stuff. But as soon as it has a connection to a far-right politics, it's totally valid to explore and absolutely not a form of discrimination. It's important stuff.
Well, I feel like that is all important. And I think, other basic facts it's important for people to know about the RSS, which, I should say Tulsi Gabbard claims she's not a member of, is that this is a nationalist organization. That means something different in a country that got independence after being colonized by the British.
Right.
But it wasn't the only nationalist or independence organization. It was banned under the British. And at the same time, a member of the RSS assassinated Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, I think that's important for people to remember in the context of this conversation, and not just because the links between the RSS and political violence continue to this day, but because there are different visions even in Hindu politics in India. The majority ethnic religious politics that are viciously at odds for each other. So the situation with having someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who at her wedding there was the Secretary General of the BJP, right, the party that the RSS dominates. The Secretary General Ram Madhav was at her wedding, and he brought a gift from Narendra Modi, the BJP leader, who's currently engaging in basically acting like he did when he was governor of Gujarat and covering up pogroms against Muslims and other minority groups. So I think it's too much to ask Americans to understand all of the intricacies of Indian history and politics, but they should know that Tulsi Gabbard, being the only Hindu in Congress, is like to draw a comparison with, it would be like a member of the DUP being the only Irish representative in Congress, or a hardline Likudnik being the only Jewish person in Congress. It's her, association with this group, but especially with Hindutva politicians in India, is something that it would be nice, if it wasn't me, the white guy, talking about it. But there isn't as much representation for Hindus in American politics as there should be, given the demographics. So unfortunately, I have to break this down as best I can.
Thinking of a new bit where Tulsi Gabbard goes, "Hi, I'm Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard from the 2nd District in Hawaii. There's differing feelings on the assassination of Mohandas K. Gandhi. Some think he was a great independence leader and promoter of nonviolence and peace, and that his killing was a tragedy. Others think that he was a weak ascetic who gave in to the Muslims at every turn. I want to say that both sides need to sit down and listen to each other." All right.
Well, she was questioned, just while we're still talking about her and not just the background of, some of her shadier ties. I mean, she was asked once about, the RSS and discrimination in India. And, let me just read her statement. She said, "Well, there is no doubt there is some discrimination directed toward different religious minorities in India. Throughout India, you will find Muslims, Christians, and people of all kinds of religions free to practice their faith. However, you will not find this degree of tolerance or openness in countries like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, or other Muslim countries."
Right.
I mean, that you made a joke just sort of intuitively, but I mean, that's not far from her actual view on this. And I think it would be
what I really never understand about those statements. It is like, look, it's a fool's errand to deny. It's like, yeah, certainly. Well, I mean, there's big differences between those three countries in terms of other religions. Saudi Arabia by far being the most extreme, where like you literally can't, go to a church, right? But there's no doubt that yes, if you did a relative scale, even in the current climate, India performs better than certainly Saudi Arabia, most probably Pakistan, and actually Iran would be more competitive if it didn't do what it did to the Baha'is, right? But it actually officially allows for Jewish and Christian religion inside.
But she's sending a dog whistle.
Well, no, that's the point. Is that number one, she's sending a dog whistle, and number two, it's like, well, okay. First, here's your anti-Muslim dog whistle. Number two, like, I thought that you wanted to be, judged and promoting your politics on like a vertical, like basically like the best standards and a promotion of, supposedly these values you hold dear anywhere, anytime, any place. But it's either that in the case of backing al-Sisi in Egypt, Muslims maybe can be just treated differently, writ large, if they're going to be sort of rounded up by some new, incompetent military dictator in Egypt, which he's voiced support for. Or, in India, maybe there can be a double standard for Muslims because of these other countries I'm in dog whistle about. And then by the, so I've just never, I feel like even taking it on its own terms, anytime people kind of pull out an analogy like that, and people do this in Israel all the time. It's like, well, okay, if you really want to justify having an apartheid state because, somebody walking around Tel Aviv might have a better time than they would in, fill in the blank, okay. But, well, at the very least, you shouldn't then turn around and talk about being some beacon of something in the Middle East, should you? But that being as it may, Corey, you're going to stick around while we do a very important segment, which I know you've heard, and certainly Richard Wolff hears, and a lot of people hear, or maybe they don't hear, or they hear. That is, of course, look at him, he's gearing up. David always gets real antsy before his segment. He's always just he's rustling his papers like, all right, got it. Modi's not good. It's time for my motherfucking segment. David Griscom, Economic Minute. Corey, are you ready for this?
I'm ready for this. I am ready.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to talk about what seems like a depressing yearly tradition is when Oxfam releases their report on inequality. And spoiler alert, inequality is getting way worse across the globe, like significantly worse. Last year in 2018, 26 people own more than 3.8 billion folks. That's half of the world's population. That's less people. That's only slightly more people than the amount of people you bring to like the World Cup squad, like one team, World Cup team. I mean, it's unbelievable. Now, it's also important to remember that this number has been trending down just in the past year. In 2017, 42 people owned 50% of the world's wealth compared to 26. So the concentration is even getting bigger and bigger. There are 2,208 billionaires, and they saw their wealth increase by 900 billion in 2018, which is a 12% increase. Remember, you don't get great wealth without great poverty. And the share of wealth for the bottom 50% of the world fell by 11%. So now that 10 years from the financial crisis, the number of billionaires has doubled. 3.4 billion people are living on less than $5.50 a day. Oxfam also reported that $7.6 trillion is likely hidden in tax-exempt offshore accounts. Now, here's a number that I really wanted to focus on, though, because I know a lot of people have been seeing this Oxfam report. $10 trillion of unpaid care work that is done by women was done in 2018. So that's $10 trillion that is unpaid. Right? And it's very important to understand the role of social reproduction in capitalism. This is work that is unpaid, but it's completely necessary for society to function. And it's not surprising that there's such a large gap in wealth between men and women when women, for the most part, are doing so much labor that is unpaid and unrespected by society. Oxfam said that to mitigate this, we definitely need society to be focusing more on trying to alleviate the unpaid work by providing more public services. But it's also something that we definitely need to talk, about cultural issues, and also just understand the fact that like the gender inequity across the world is very much a part of global capitalism. That's $10 trillion that is basically not being paid, that is meant to reproduce the labor power that produces all of the wealth in society. Now, lastly, I just wanted to remind us again that, the very first GEM segment, we talked about this, where 40...
Look at this. He's like... Oh, let's go back to the beginning of class. All right, David. Well done with the callback, buddy.
Remember, all the aid that we talk about that's given to Africa, right. $40 billion more are taken out of Africa each year than the amount of aid that goes into it. So we're living in a world right now where there's all this aid, but there's still massive exploitation that's going on underneath the surface. And lastly, we can't just talk about taxing this wealth away. I mean, we really need to be going to the source, because you don't get this kind of wealth without exploitation, without imperialism, without sexism, and without undervaluing labor across the board. We can't just come after these things with simple solutions. We need to be bold in our commitment to righting this wrong, because it's never been as bad as it is right now, and it's only getting worse year by year.
Now, Corey, you've often said, in spite of all the naysayers, living standards are only getting better and poverty is only decreasing. Would you like to provide the contrapoint?
Yeah, I find it ironic that you're, leveraging this critique of capitalism and inequality on a web format that was brought to you by
That's good, right? on the internet. Obviously, it's bullshit to talk about the Oxfam report. Of course, that's a good one. You know what I want to do, guys? We're usually this is a teaser. Usually now the gulag segment is firmly in the post game, but I think this fits so well. I want to do those two different sounds with Corey before we go to the post game. We'll do we don't have to play the whole music, but this is going to be the gulag segment because this fits perfectly. Those two pieces of sound. So, Corey, are you familiar with Anand Giridharadas?
No, fill me in.
So he wrote, I forget the name of his book.
Winners Take All.
Winners Take All. So he's basically a guy that you know how occasionally like the Aspen Institute and other places, they kind of like to, they obviously are always sort of trying to brand themselves in terms of do-gooderism, but they also occasionally like to have somebody like a guy like Umair Haque, who I'm not actually, I haven't read him in quite a while, but he used to blog for the Harvard Business Review and whatever. And again, I wouldn't say it wasn't necessarily like socialist politics, but he would write some very scathing things about Wall Street that one would be like, oh, I wouldn't expect to see that polemic in the Harvard Business Review, right?
Yes, so, I'm Googling this author, and I think I read an excerpt when it came out.
Yeah, so what's fascinating, though, is that Anand is taking this to a whole other level. So he's getting all of these platforms, whether they be at Davos or on these television networks, and he's actually saying, guys, he called Davos a reunion of world ruiners, to paraphrase it, saying philanthropy will make no difference. A couple of weeks ago, he was talking about, he was at a summit, some ideas summit in Chicago, and basically helpfully reminded the moderator of the panel that the seminar that they were doing was being sponsored by a company that was still underwriting the Saudi investment forum. This was at the height of the focus on the Khashoggi murder by the Saudis.
He's got the Mark Blythe hustle going.
Yeah.
Where you get paid to tell rich people that they're a bunch of jerks.
Yes. And he's fucking nailing it. But I actually we're going to see how long, because he just humiliated a Bloomberg panel or CNBC panel. He's really going for it. And these two clips he just tweeted out earlier today. Well, I'll tell you the tweet. But first, this is him pissing Tony Blair off. And then there's him pissing Bill Gates off. Now, the Blair clip includes a clip of Anand himself. The Gates clip is just a question being relayed from him to Bill Gates. But we're going to watch both of these clips back to back, and then I think we'll probably all sentence together Davos to the gulag. But let's start with Christian Amanpour relaying to Tony Blair Anand's critique.
Let me just play you this little soundbite from a guy who's kind of gone viral right now, Anand Giridharadas, who's just written this book, Winner Takes All, the charade of the global elites. Look what he just told me.
I think Davos should end. I think it should be canceled this year and should end going forward. It is a family reunion for the people who, in my view, broke the modern world.
I mean, you can't argue with that, right?
I can. Look. It's the easiest line in the world to make, by the way. I tell you what I do when I come to Davos. So later today, I'll be meeting 3 of my presidents from Africa. I don't think they broke the economic system. I'll be meeting a whole lot of people from multilateral institutions who work in the developing world. I'm here because my institute, which is a not-for-profit institute, works in some of the poorest parts of the world trying to help them. And, to be fair, the people who come here, they're discussing serious issues. So it's the easiest play in the world. Say, oh, all these people are coming along here, the global elite and so on. And by the way, these arguments about cultural identity and nationalism, in my experience, you've got elites on either side of the argument. So, Davos, it is what it is. It's an opportunity for people to come and network on issues of importance. And, some people, may come here who are billionaires from different parts of the world, but other people come because some of the issues that they're discussing here are important.
All of that money that Tony Blair has made lobbying for oil companies and dictators has definitely degraded his speech skills. He used to be a lot more silver-tongued. But I just like a few things there. Let me just take an easy pot shot and say that yes, it is easy to say that the elites that gather in Davos have wrecked the world, because they have. From climate to the global economic meltdown to the rise of fascism in the world today. I also thought it was funny that he immediately pivoted to his consulting work in Africa with his quote-unquote My African Presidents. That's Tony Blair failing. Now here's Bill Gates getting the Anand hit himself.
Here's a somewhat more critical question from Anand Giridharadas, who's written a book called Winner Take All. What do you think of the rising chorus of philanthropy's critics get right? There's people who feel, and Anand argues that for many, philanthropy is a way of not really changing the fundamental system, but a way of making us kind of feel better and perpetuating inequalities.
Well, if people think, communism works better or something, I don't know. To me, the system can constantly be detuned, and I'm a believer in an estate tax. I'm a believer in more progressive taxation. I think we have a system that works, but we can
look at his knee bouncing
to achieve more equality. Things like the earned income tax credit should be made substantially more generous. The people who suggest there's an alternate system, I'll just respectfully disagree with them, that some radically different system would both create good things and give us the wealth that we should spread in a more equal way.
Wow. So I love that clip because that's evidence again that billions of dollars and a brilliant talent for computing does not a deep political thinker make. In the ongoing failure in our popular discourse that confuses, as an example, setting up a computer business with an ability to solve political problems. Corey, your thoughts. And I just want to say really quickly, we don't have it in front of us, but I can summarize. Anand tweeted out today that he got DM'd by a friend, like, you pissed off Tony Blair and Bill Gates in one day. Who's next? Bono? And Anand said, funny you should say that, because an interview about my opinions on Bono's philanthropy is going to be dropping tomorrow. So it's like, all right, like, Godspeed, Anand. Corey?
I'll keep an eye open for that. I will say, I'll take these in order, I guess. Tony Blair was smiling way too much for a British person.
Yep.
And he had definitely been hitting the spiced wine up there on the slopes. I think that's the only explanation for his babbling. As for Bill Gates, I spent a couple of the most miserable professional months of my life working for a company that was 100% owned by Bill Gates. And what I learned from that experience is he has no idea what's going on. He's not even good at business. That's the problem with a monopolist, right? You don't even have to do what you are claiming to do in order to make money. And his ignorance and arrogance are stupefying. I mean, by modern tech guy standards, I guess he seems like kind of restrained, but he is a greedy motherfucker who has really a much more impoverished sense of what the world is like, despite the fact that he, reads every book in Oprah's book club.
Well, I don't know. I thought communism didn't work. So like these are the fucking intellects that are held up in the society. It's like a sophomore year shit.
But that's the thing with Bill Gates, though. It's not accidental that he rattles off all the things that he supports, and it's not accidental that he puts so much money into media companies to give him glowing coverage.
Right.
It is a facade. They understand what they're doing, I think, more than like they seem like they're babbling idiots when they're put on the spot because they don't have a prepared response to that because they've been putting down.
It was never supposed to get to this
point.
point.
There's nobody in the room who will call bullshit.
Yeah,
there's nobody in the room that's going to say, "What are you talking about?" Actually, or like, "What have you read on the subject of communism, Bill Gates?" I mean, that would be a great follow-up question.
Or like
right?
that, yeah. Like, what have you read on? Right? Have you read any books? Or like Yasha Monk didn't say to Tony Blair, like, when Tony Blair was like, and by the way, you know, there are elites that don't like black people, and there are elites that listen to Putumayo records like myself. So suck my dick, Anand.
It is what it is.
It is what it is. That was my favorite part, actually. That was the part where I related to Tony Blair. That he speaks to my inner. Tony Blair is definitely my evil animal spirit, no doubt. And I totally relate to like being on a fucking ski slope in Davos, being like, dude, I'm making like fucking $50,000 a month, like calling a Chinese premier for a Saudi oil guy. It's 10 minutes of work. I've got like a fucking nice blue shirt on. Like, it is what it is, Christian. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, fuck you. It's like, all right, fucking Indian Andrew Dice Clay. Oh, yeah, real clever point. Well, you know what? Davos is fucking complicated, man. And I've got African people that I'm working with. And this doesn't sound good. Is what it is.
You know, it's funny, too, because he's kind of calling BS on her. I mean, I met Christiane Amanpour once, and the only thing I remember from the whole interaction is her saying, it's a sentence fragment, and it was delivered with a flourish and sort of a wave of her hand, was like, when I was in Africa. I mean, it was like...
Are you serious?
Yeah.
She was actually that much of like...
Yes.
Because if you were scripting it and you wrote and you were like, and then Christiane Amanpour turned and said, with a flourish, when I was in Africa, it would be like, all right, we need a rewrite on that. That's too.
I think that drove me back to the bar.
Yeah. Like,
that's my
I'll get a
memory.
drink.
It probably wasn't quite so smooth. But, you know, that's what they do at Davos, too, is... you know, try to impress each other with how like well-informed they are. And whenever a video comes out of what they're actually talking about, it's just like, oh my God. It's like, it is like, and you know, the juxtaposition with Bill Gates too is great, because it's like, the guy invented, and it's his fault. The PowerPoint is everywhere. Right. And like,
yes.
Like, these people are responsible for the slideshow in the office meeting that never ends. I mean, it's their world that we're just sort of struggling through, and their idea of what passes for, you know, intellectualism is just embarrassing whenever it's put on display. Except the only people who are allowed to witness it firsthand are there on the condition that they never talk about how stupid it all is.
Right.
And how much.
And these, by the way, both of these guys, Blair and Gates, are big fans of Steve Pinker's book, which again should be another tell you everything you need to know moment. Corey Pein, remind everybody all the ways that people can follow your excellent work.
Well, I'm at Corey Pein on Twitter. I have a podcast on Patreon, patreon.com/newsfromnowhere. And I have a book that should be out in a new, more portable and somewhat cheaper format soon, well, in the near to medium future, called Live, Work, 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 Die, A Journey to the Savage Heart of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, well, you know, I think communism didn't work. So, but I mean, I guess other people have other ideas, but you know, that's just me.
Yeah, there's more Bill Gates stories in there.
Oh, beautiful. Corey, thanks a million.
Thanks.
All right, folks. Become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show today. We need to get to that 2,000 patron goal and, of course, keep moving onward and upward. There'll be a few more things we do offer when we get, not too many, but a few more when we offer different sort of potential social media things, other things when we get to that 2,000 patron mark. And, of course, we'll continue grinding out those 3 shows a week, including this main long-form show, which is a very big endeavor in and of itself. We appreciate all of you. Patreon.com/TMBS. Snag your tickets to see us at the February 1st live show at the Bell House in Brooklyn. And, you know, follow all of us on Twitter, subscribe on YouTube, drop us something at the PayPal for YouTube to help us keep going on YouTube while we figure that